More items, more bosses, more Isaac. There ain't much more to it. So Binding of Isaac just got bigger once again. This is an expansion for Binding of Isaac Rebirth, one of the champions of top-down roguelike permadeath games. This is what they all get compared to, and for good reason. It's simple, addictive, and good fun. Binding of Isaac follows the story of a mother that after hearing the word of God has decided to end her son's life. After being cornered, little Isaac only has one way to go: down into the basement. To escape, he must use the power of tears to fight off the evil monsters, his demented siblings, and hideous mutations that lurk down there. That's the basics of the base game laid out, but this review is purely to do with Afterbirth Plus, a collection of new additions to the familiar formula. You get new monsters, items, bosses, and a whole new bunch of achievements. And a little warning before we jump into it, I will be showing some of the new bosses and discussing how they unlock. So spoiler alert. Now, I have to say that this time around the changes are a lot more subtle than in previous expansions. To some degree this is because the game is so packed with content that the procedurally generated nature of the game means you don't see the changes as often, but it is also because Afterbirth Plus doesn't actually contain as much. I've seen all of the new critters in action, and while there are a few interesting additions, most are little more than variants on monsters that were already there, just in a different form, like Stony, which is just a fatty that operates slightly differently, and the Poison Mind, which moves diagonally rather than the normal brains. Blisters are probably the latest annoying creature, partly because they're based on what was already one of the most irritating creatures out there. It operates in exactly the same way that Trites do, i.e. jumping around randomly, but it is also able to fire homing black smoke balls, and to make them extra annoying they also drop a spider sack on death as well. It's nice to have a few more creatures on the bestiary, which incidentally is quite a nice addition, but it doesn't really serve that much purpose. But generally speaking, the new monsters add nothing to the game itself, in my opinion. Two of the big additions are the additional chapter to the main game and the harder version of the greed mode which was introduced last time, both of which seem to be little more than adding challenge purely by spamming projectiles, huge HP pools, and less predictable movement patterns. The new chapter is the Void, which takes place after the Blue Womb, so you're nice and tender by the time you've smashed your way through to it. Fortunately, the Void is an extra large floor with multiple bosses to beef yourself up before you face one of the new bosses, Delirium. Personally, I think Delirium is a lazy new addition, as it spends most of its time in the form of all of the other bosses you've seen before, except with a whole shed load more HP and firing hundreds of projectiles constantly in all directions. I failed it the first time around, but managed to get a second shot at it purely because the game crashed and forgot that I died. Talk about a silver lining. The new harder version of Greed mode isn't much different either. You make your way through exactly the same as before, but once you've killed Ultra Greed, you meet Ultra Greedier. The only way you seem to be able to fight these new bosses is to build up some kind of Super Isaac with amped up damage and max HP. There is also a new character to play around with in the form of APOLLYON, which I've completed my first run through on. This character is actually an instant unlock as it has no prior requirements to pick it up, and quite honestly it doesn't really offer that much new. His stats are virtually identical to Isaac, the main difference being that he has one less heart, and he starts with one of the new items Void, which is probably more interesting than the character itself. The way this works is when activated you can absorb an uncollected item, and if it's an activatable it will operate the next time you use the Void. Once you've picked up several items using this you can end up with some quite bizarre effects. I seem to end up with something that showed me the entire map, chopped off my head and made me briefly invulnerable, as well as a bunch of other random stuff. You can also absorb passives, but this will just add a random pre-assigned attribute rather than any new special effects. The largest part of the update is the implementation of the workshop and the ability to add items, challenges, effects, or even entire game modes into the game. However, this is something which, unless you want to take part in creating content, could take a while to impact on the average player's game. It also seems like a dangerous recipe for a game like Binding of Isaac to me, as it treads a very careful line when it comes to balance. An overpowered item or a creature which is unkillable could completely ruin the experience, which you could argue it's up to the player whether they want to mod it or not. But as part of the update they've already said that once a month they will take the best mod and add it to the game permanently for everyone to use. Hopefully they will be carefully vetted, but it is a constant concern that the game could end up being unplayable for some people as the difficulty could go up as time goes on. It could quite easily be controlled by having toggles for the different mods, if they really do choose to go down this route. When it all comes down to it, I don't think Afterbirth Plus is worth it in its current state. The base content is average at best, and the addition of modding support could either be a winner or a killer. It's really too early to say. The only reason I can see it being worthwhile is if you've completed the majority of the content in Rebirth and Afterbirth, and you just can't wait to get your hands on more. And considering those two contain 200 to 300 hours of content themselves, you've got to be pretty committed. I've spent around 13 hours so far on Afterbirth Plus, and there's still loads more to do, and the new bosses are hard work, so it'll likely keep me going for a while longer, but I don't feel quite the same draw to it as I did after getting the first expansion. I really think that the first expansion was a sweet spot for the game.